him coming on the line just now. So I am getting Steve Hackett on right now. So we have Steve Hackett joining us here in just a couple minutes. I think we're getting,
Hey,
there he is.
There we go.
Somebody.
fantastic.
Mr. Hackett.
There we go. Yeah, yeah.
Bring you up on the board
There we
here.
go. Do a bit of that. There we go. Hi there.
Hi, how you doing? Hang on, I got some extra
Very
things
good.
here.
Very good.
Hang on, I have to change my sound here. I have an extra, there we go. That sounds better. An
Good.
extra piece of audio there that we did not need. Good morning, sir. How are you doing?
Very good, Mark. Very nice to talk to you.
So you're down in Mobile, Alabama right now.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. First time here. Really looking forward to that. But yes. It's all happening. Very busy time as
Happy
usual.
St. Patrick's Day to you.
Thank you very much.
Any
Now, was
celebrations
that
going?
today or was that tomorrow?
Well, it depends. So I think the kids are probably out celebrating last night, but
Yeah,
the
they
official
were.
day is today, March
That's right.
17th.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting to know. Yeah. So we'll be doing a St. Patrick's show, a day show tonight. We
I'm
will
sure
be
you'll
doing
have
that.
some very excited people in the audience that might be a little over caffeinated.
Or over Guinnessed as well.
There you go. Exactly. Well, it's an honor to have you on the show this morning. I've actually been showcasing a lot of your music here, so I've been playing
Thank
a lot
you.
of your stuff, and I'm actually a huge fan. So I'll do a little fan.
Oh, sure.
So that's the first
Why not?
album I got, and
Yeah.
basically just started picking up a
That
bunch
one.
of the rest of
Ah,
these.
good
So
Lord. Good Lord. Yeah.
I've loved all your
yeah.
music for years. So it's
Oh,
been a
well, thank you.
fantastic. Oh,
Thank
it's
you
just
so
been a
much.
fantastic ride.
I'm glad
So,
you like those. Yeah, those are all, I think they're all 70s
yeah.
things. No, actually, Highly Strung is 80s, but yeah, I mean, it's all so long ago, and yet it's so current because that's what some of what we play. Obviously, we rotate things quite a bit, and the new one just took off like wildfire, which is wonderful for me. Went to the top of the rock and metal charts in the UK. So Circus and the Night Whale, the new one,
Yeah.
has taken off big time, and we're doing 3 tracks off that currently.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
that's going down very well. I'm very heartened when new music goes down well as all the old Genesis classics and all of that stuff.
So looking back at old music, in your book, you described so many experiences that you had where you got to see bands like Paul Butterfield and King Crimson and some of these
Oh,
bands right in
yes,
their early formation days.
yes,
Do you remember the
yes.
first show that you went and saw and who that might have been?
Well, I started to go watch blues shows. I had some friends who were smitten with blues as I was, and I saw John Mayall's Blues Breakers. First time I was let out as an adult when I was 16, if you know what I mean. And
Yeah.
And it was Peter Green was on guitar with him, and Eric Clapton had not long left. We didn't even know who Peter Green was, but we thought he was wonderful. And the same year, I got to see, which was 1966, I got to see Paul Butterfield, and he had Mike Bloomfield on guitar, Elvin Bishop on guitar, Mark Nafthalin on keyboards, and I thought they were just wonderful. It was just the best I had ever seen. And as an early harmonica player, I was fascinated to know what he was doing with that. That was at least as interesting as what was going on guitar, but the combination of the 2 or 3 was incendiary for me.
They describe Eel Pie Island as being a magical place that you got drawn to,
Yes.
and so you saw a lot of this music there, I would assume.
That's right. Yes, I saw John Mayall there several times. Paul Butterfield once. They only did one tour of the UK, but it was and they were just playing to a handful of people. But it was such a wonderful show. It was a lesson in how to turn a disaster into a triumph.
Now, you mentioned being near Eel Pie Island recently. I assume that there's nothing of that scene left there anymore.
The island is still there. It's a boatyard. Funnily enough, Phil Collins mentions it. I had no idea that his family had any association with it, but I think they had some kind of thing going with the place, and I think that had to do with his early years of being a young child actor, dancer, singer, and all of those things. And I think maybe it's just a place to escape to. So I had no idea that he'd been aware of that place. So my association with it was later. I think for him, it was in his very early years, pre-teen years. But it was a magical place where Eric Clapton cut his teeth there, and many other British acts, the Kinks, the Who, the Stones. I mean, my God, it was a kind of a mecca on the Thames, that famous river, just outside of London, about 10 miles outside the centre of London, still within Greater London. And it was a great place to go, to walk over that bridge and hear the strains of music in the background. It was a kind of blues mecca for some of us.
Has there been any talk of resurrecting any of that scene, or is
No,
it?
I think the British are very slow to realize what they've got, and unfortunately, they built this characterless housing estate on the top of it, and of course, local museums celebrate the early pictures of Mick Jagger and Brian Jones and all of those who were associated with the place. It had been a dance hall. I think it had been erected in the 1930s, I think, with a sprung floor. So, that place had seen waltzers and jazzers and trad jazzers, and then R&B, rhythm and blues, all of that. And I think, the British blues scene really kind of centered on that place. The Stones were doing the Station Hotel, which was in Richmond itself, which was about a mile away. And so I think they would hover between the two. And I guess it was a very smoky dive, but it's that thing where, when it's early days and you realize you're watching something exceptional, the sawdust and the smells fade into the distance, and it becomes something else, which is magical and character forming and life affirming and all sorts of things. I wanted to be a blues guitarist in those days. That was my plan. Of course, the blues boom in England really died on me, as it did a whole legion of other wannabes, of course. And so music started to change, and that which had been a guilty pleasure, which had been listening to classical music and various other things, suddenly was starting to come to the fore, and it made for other possibilities. So you could use those classical influences or those jazz aspirations, and rock and pop was virtually interchangeable at that time. I think very much in the wake of what the Beatles had done, and also not to forget what Jeff Beck had done himself in the very early days with the Yardbirds, with Shapes of Things, with that guitar solo that was seminal for so many of us, where suddenly a blues band suddenly goes Egyptian, and psychedelia was born right there.
Well, you have such a unique style of music, and it brings together so many different cultures. And it just seems like it came from your background. In other words, you had classical guitar training by listening to Andre Segovia. You had crooners that your parents were playing around the house. You get to see all these up and coming rock forming bands that were going to be transformational in rock. And you were able to take all that into your head and basically start to, I think, have that formulate your sound. Is that kind of what happened?
Well, I think that London was a great place to be. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was at the center of development. And when you're young, you can dismiss certain things, but because I've had decades to reflect on this, the effect of certain characters upon the mainstream of rock, Pete Seeger influencing Dylan, bringing him to the fore, Peter, Paul and Mary, people who were banned from appearing on American TV because of their pacifist views that were considered to be incendiary at the time. And now it just seems like it's all part of the establishment. But the effect upon the Beatles wasn't lost on the rest of us, to expand their writing to include themes other than boy meets girl, boy loses girl. And so in terms of the development of music, I think it's very important to see the link. And so you might dismiss someone in the chain of events and influences, but you have to be aware that the Beatles and the Beach Boys were influencing each other, harmony bands that could use the effect of barbershop quartets and many other things. And of course, it goes right back to classical music and church music and the idea of antiphonal answering stuff, and much more. I mean, we can't really do a music seminar here, but it seems to me that bands become each other and writers become each other. And every time someone says to me, "Oh, what you've done, it sounds a bit like so-and-so," and I think, well, yes, of course. Many British bands became each other once the sort of structure of those bands started to break down and people moved on. You've got King Crimson working with ELP, the family tree goes on, working with Genesis, working with Yes, and I've worked with lots of people from these bands, and many more, thousands more. But and people start to become each other. The individual becomes less important, perhaps, and the whole movement, the orientation towards growth, is simply, I think, a natural consequence of actually listening to people and going, yeah, well, actually, yes, they had something to offer here. Jan and Dean had something to offer the Beach Boys, which had something to offer the Beatles, listening to each other, trying to outdo each other, trying to almost respond. Here's a letter from me, a letter from America, passport to Pimlico, where I grew up, all of that kind of stuff.
Well, I was interested to read that you were kind of claiming to be the one responsible for turning Peter Gabriel onto some of the African rhythm sounds. And I was kind of wondering who you might have heard that would have, you would have been influenced by, and kind of those artists at the time that you were listening to.
Well, I'd just done an album in Brazil called Till We Have Faces, and I'd worked with lots of different percussionists and drummers. My idea was that I really didn't understand rhythm properly. I didn't understand rhythm until I immersed myself fully in percussion. So a fully immersive sojourn, in a way, where people would come in and show me their skills. Very often it would be one man, one drum, never mind a complete drum kit. I think the economics or the deprivations meant that that was the mother of invention. One man with a little tiny drum called a repiki with one drumstick would get lots of different sounds out of it and rhythms out of it. People like Ayeto Moreira, who can do a drum solo on a tambourine, that kind of stuff. And of course, when he plays that in front of a crowd, straight away, give me an encore. It's extraordinary stuff. So having done that, I wanted to play to Pete because I knew that he was very conscious of rhythms. So he said, "Oh, I'm going to visit. Can I have your phone book? Can I have those numbers?" So yes, of course. But as I say, people become each other. I think although we were no longer working in the same band, we were giving each other pointers to say, yes, check out this guy. And I think he had a very interesting time collating rhythms and the way that he works. So yeah, I think we influenced each other and perhaps continue to influence each other beyond the confines of a band and what that can actually do.
Every year we have a program that comes through Chicago. It's the World Music Festival, and they get bands in from all over the world. And it's amazing to see some of these African bands that come through. I don't know if you've ever seen artists like Salif Keita or Amadou and Miriam. Have you ever seen or heard of them?
No, I've not, but that sounds very interesting. Interesting,
Yeah,
yes.
there's some performers you may want to check out. They're both from Mali. Salif
Right.
Keita is an interesting story. He came from Malian royalty, and so his
Right.
family basically persecuted him. he was not allowed to pursue music because the family did not want to have that. And so
Right.
he was also an albino. And so
Mm.
he had double persecution because he's an albino in an African country and his family did not appreciate music. And so he still
Yep.
wanted to pursue that. And so he
Yeah.
is this Malian prince that
Mm.
followed his dream and has some amazing music. And then
Right.
Amadou and Miriam is a blind couple. They met at a school for the blind in Mali. And they did
Really.
some demo tapes and gave them to David Bowie. And he was the one who actually got their music popular. So they've done
Right.
some collaboration work recently with a number
Mm.
of different popular artists. So very, very good stuff.
Well, I think challenges uh, work for people in a way. There's a similar story with Rudolf Nureyev and his father disapproving of his son's dancing and trying to beat the dancing out of his son. Of course, the nearest equivalent in my life would be working with Genesis, although I didn't go to the same school. The local record shop was out of bounds, and of course they would be beaten if they transgressed and went there. But so what does that do? What it does is it creates a career. That's it. Whatever you tell a child not to do, if he's passionate enough about it, he's going to go do it. So yes, the disapproval of family, disapproval of school, all of that. But at the end of the day, we're after winning the approval of listeners.
Well, to me, it was amazing how much you were transformational in the sound of Genesis. When you came into that band, I don't think they realized kind of what they had gotten in your strong desire to not only bring in intricate guitar work, but also this idea to introduce the mellotron. Do you think there was one
Yeah.
thing more than another that changed their sound, or you think they were both equally important?
Well, it's impossible to quantify, really. When you look back, you can either you can celebrate this and say, oh yes, I was responsible for this and that and the other, and the light show and the mellotron and the synth and all that. But they're all just tools for people to use. It's what they do with them. But I wanted to have an overview. It was important for me to have an effect on a band to mentor them or torment them into doing certain things. The Chinese water torture effect was the way I sort of operated. Drip, 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 drip. We've got to do this. We've got to do that, and so outwardly I wouldn't always be listened to, but I knew that it did have an effect because it was challenging, and they needed challenging to move on from the things that had inspired in the early days. Nothing wrong with a link with folk music and 12-string guitars and all those beautiful things, but I knew that it had to do something with wider dynamics and more drama and to give it power and edge. And I think the fact that Phil joined just about the same time that I did, Phil Collins, who was easily the loudest drummer I'd ever worked with in one room, and I had to get myself a bigger amp just to be heard above the drums in the yeah, I mean that was a big shock. I mean, I've been used to working in miniature with little tiny sounds, as I still do today when I'm recording at home. There's no tyranny of volume. I use very little amplification because I want the sound to be pure. There shouldn't be any tyranny of volume. You shouldn't have to turn up the sound so much to excite yourself into believing you're doing something exceptional. It should work at low volume and still be screaming. Then you crank it up and celebrate it. But these days you don't have to play loud to play good. Whereas in the early days with me, if you wanted distortion from amps, you had to turn it up and crank it and get those valves and tubes working for you. And of course, that wasn't always friendly on domestic or in domestic situations. So whenever the sound got slightly good, someone would be asking you to turn it down. And now I turn it down voluntarily. Uh, but so yeah, volume. And I've heard all this argument about, well, you know, you need to be cranked up at volume to move some air. That works, but then when you A/B it against amp modeling and so many of the things that are available now, you say, well, can you tell the difference? Maybe the floor isn't thumping quite so much, but when you play it back on speakers, it's practically indistinguishable from the real thing. So it's another way of going at it.
Well, just prior to this, I played an interview from you guys from 2014. So it was when you had a
Right.
Genesis reunion,
Yes.
kind of an interview, and you had all gotten together. And I played a segment that talked about the importance of you and Phil being
Yeah.
introduced to the band.
Yes.
And Phil did have such an incredibly dynamic sound, and you guys almost lost him to Yes. So it was amazing to think that,
Yes.
how much that band would have changed either on Yes's point of view or, your
Yeah.
band, the
Yeah.
fact that you wound up with him. So it was
Yeah.
amazing
Well,
stroke of luck.
it's funny. Yes. You mentioned Yes, and of course the young Yes were very important for Phil. And I think he sometimes used to roadie for Bill Bruford. You know, he just wanted to be around them. And I think Phil probably wanted to turn Genesis into Yes. Um, and you can understand that because, you know, they had great vocal harmonies, they had great precision, um, great power. Ironically, I was the guy who ended up working with more Yes members than anybody. I worked with Steve Howe, his predecessor in the band, Pete Banks, Chris Squire, and I did several things together, including the Hackett album. I had GTR with Steve Howe, and you know this kind of cross pollination thing has gone on for quite some time. As I say, it's all a case of bands becoming each other and hopefully not threatening the lineup at any time. But yeah, we cast an ear to them, they cast an ear to us. There was lots of associations with King Crimson and Yes. In fact, my first Genesis Revisited had a cross section of you know, some of these bands, and of course that crossed over into Asia and various other things for John Wetton, King Crimson, all of that. So I think, you know, you could say there's, you know, a fair amount of first division and second and third division replacements. I think, you know, we probably all could have become, we could have all become each other if fate had taken a different taken a different turn. But I suspect we were all listening to the same things. Chris Squire grew up as a choir boy. At the same time, I was listening to classical music and church music and all of those things. Peter Gabriel was listening more to, I think, a cross between Otis Redding, Nina Simone, Music Concrete, which was to become the whole sort of sampling era. Later on, Mike Rutherford was more Judy Collins and Led Zeppelin. You know, I mean, so you've got these things. I was listening to Buffy St. Marie, Bob Dylan, all of the blues people where the sonic developments were happening in the world of guitar and harmonica and all of the rest. There were a lot of different influences that came to bear on Genesis. We were pulling in lots of different directions. Tony Banks was very classical at that time and also pop. You know, he and I were fans of Roy Orbison. We loved his voice and his romantic approach. Plus, we were also fans, all of us, of Jimmy Webb and Richie Havens, who I got to work with. And I had something through from Jimmy Webb recently saying hi, which was very, very lovely as far as I'm concerned. So, probably the best living American songwriter as far as as far as I'm concerned, I love the fact that that his songs described the whole of America, the Western, as put to song. So many songs that were a romance of place,
Wichita lineman.
Wichita, Galveston, Phoenix, all these places. So figures in a landscape, almost like paintings where these stories were coming to life. And of course, MacArthur Park, again, it's the place, but it's the relationship within the place that's so wonderful and was such an influence on Genesis, the 7-minute single. The whole idea of, well, you don't just have to have A, B, and a bit of C, but you can have other things, this other verse that happens, and the instrumental break and all of that. It's kind of the template for a lot of progressive stuff that I know that England is credited with having developed. But of course, it started over here, this side of the pond. So the effect went backwards and forwards. Jimmy Webb was a huge fan of Vaughan Williams. Is this connection to church music, where he was Jimmy was playing in church. His father was a churchman, and so that idea of English and American music influencing from each side of the pond was very important. And I think that use of harmony that was so great with his keyboard parts and orchestrations and many other things. So a couple of seminal songs, Wichita Lineman you mentioned, absolutely brilliant, wonderful. MacArthur Park, absolutely brilliant and wonderful, and great arrangements that went with these things. Answering phrases within the within the so-called backing, so that there was not really a lot of separation between the two. The whole sort of pageant that was part of MacArthur Park, almost as if you were watching a medieval film put to music, perhaps. So films for the ear rather than the eye. Very big part of progressive music, music that tells a story and is full of surprises, perhaps.
You talk about being so proud of your song Can Utility and the Coastliners as being one of the first Genesis songs that you wrote. How many of the lyrics, like what percentage of the lyrics do you think you were responsible for in Genesis songs?
Well, in that song, I wrote all the lyric. A lot of the time, when Peter Gabriel was the front man, he wanted to sing his own lyrics. So obviously there was a limitation because of that. And I would find myself, writing lyrics for that, for Blood on the Rooftops, various other things, and at times just suggesting a line or a title to Pete, like the Return of the Giant Hogweed, or parts of what's the song, A Battle of Ebbing Forest, this kind of thing.
So you contributed various parts of those lyrics?
Various parts of various lyrics at various times. 11th Earl of Mar, there's a song that arrives in the middle that really doesn't really relate to the rest of the song, but it's interesting in terms of the development of where it might go, so that it goes acoustic right in the middle, and it's all based on nylon guitars, which people weren't using in rock at the time, and it's still not terribly prevalent, but you get it with the work of Sting occasionally and Madonna.
Yeah.
So Dominic Miller working with Sting, who I met before he was working with Sting. But nylon guitar, there's something about that, the romance that's possible with that, whether it's classical or flamenco, and it's not a bright sound, so I can see why steel strings were most important with acoustic guitars first of all, with pop music. But later on, what you come to realize is that nylon guitar can be very bright, but it's the bass strings that really give it the brightness, because they are wound. The nylon strings at the top often can be very gentle, but there's a big difference between listening to Paco de Lucia and with that sort of machine gun approach, compared to Andres Segovia, where you get all of these different tones, the fully orchestrated guitar, although there are no other instruments most of the time. So that was a big deal for us, and to show the different ways that instrument could be used.
That's fantastic. We have to do a station ID here in just a second. So it's 11 o'clock.
Yep.
You're listening to WZRD Chicago, 88.3 FM, and streaming worldwide at WZRDchicago.org. We got Mr. Steve Hackett on the line right now. We're interviewing him and promotion of his concert that's coming up. So he's going to be in town here on March 29th. It's going to be at the Copernicus Center. He is going to be recreating the Foxtrot album. It's the 50th anniversary of Genesis's Foxtrot album. And it's an amazing thing to see. He came through back in November and did a show, and we're doing a recreation of that. And I assume there's going to be some differences between this show and the last show. Is that right?
Yes, we're doing at least 3 things off the new album, The Circus and the Night Whale, which, as I talking earlier, saying that album subsequently just went to the top of the rock and metal charts in the UK, and also riding high in the German charts. So I said that if it was going to do that, then I was going to do more things from it. So yeah, it will be substantially different to the show that people saw before. But then you also get the whole of Foxtrot that was and has been so popular ever since John Lennon said that Genesis was not only one of the bands that he was listening to, but he considered us to be true sons of the Beatles, which is the best review I've ever had from anybody. So I'm very proud of that what we did in those early days, which was album-based material in the pre-MTV approved pop version of Genesis. I'm still very proud of what we did as an albums act, back in those days.
One of our listeners was wondering if you were inspired by Mr. Kite, the Beatles song, on some of your Supper's Ready stuff. He felt there was a similar sound on those 2 songs.
I think so, yeah. I think that the section called Willow Farm is pure Beatles, and so I can see why Lennon picked up on that. Although it's influenced by the Beatles, it's good Beatles, because it's there was something that Pete and I had listened to in the 1960s, in the mid 1960s. You had They're Coming to Take Me Away, Ha Ha, and that had a sped up voice on it. So Pete was using very speed on the voice to make it go cartoony and do that kind of caricature thing. So yes, Mr. Kite, very influential. That idea of Mr. Kite is based on a poster that Lennon had of I think it was a fairground or a circus that was performing on the ice when the Thames was frozen over.
Yeah.
So and a lot of the characters that are mentioned in the song are straight off of the poster. So yeah, there's that, and Pete was saying, "Oh, this is." I said, "So what's this all about?" And he said, "Well, it's like a Zen farm where everything can change." And so, sometimes if you asked for an explanation from Pete, you would end up no wiser. But in his mind, that's it. So it goes a bit of goes from Beatles to Lao Tzu and various Chinese sages. He loved, the I Ching and all of that, Pete. So yeah, lots of influences, lots of stuff. Beatles, absolutely, sure.
It's a little bit like his song introductions. I always get a kick out of Peter Gabriel when he's introducing a song. He always has some kind of a very twisted story that goes on there.
Yeah, you won't get a straight explanation, but you'll get an idea of some of the influences that come to bear on it. Yeah.
One of the things you talk about in your book is you talk about the shift in music to punk rock and how that
Yes,
basically kind of what you're kind of almost looking at is destroyed rock music or your form or your happy place in rock music. You were going along creating albums thinking everything is great, and all of a sudden the music
yeah,
industry says, "Hey, we don't want your sound anymore." So
yes.
what was that like? And do you feel like you can still be relevant in how you kind of came over that or came across
Yeah.
that?
Well, I think that, the best of music is full of surprises. And my philosophy is that music should be pan-genre. It should borrow from lots of styles in order to be surprising, so that a song can take all sorts of twists and turns. And so for punk to come along and complain about that just seemed to be pure jealousy. It's not as if you've got people in country music who say to you that country is everything, soul music is terrible, rock music, that's all passe. But for some reason in England, the press seemed to take up the cry of, the very people who'd been listening to Yes and Genesis were suddenly they were saying, yeah, we were in their gun sights, and which was ironic for people who'd maybe been playing for about 6 weeks to that point, to go, yeah, you don't need this, you don't need virtuosity, you don't need a show, you don't need that. I can understand in terms of the jealousy of any band that comes on stage and has hardware. They have everything. They have the lasers, they have the dancing girls in the wings, lots of things to fall back on that are part and parcel of various rock shows. But to say it's all got to go back to the roots, it's all got to be three chords, is just saying minimalism rules. Okay, nothing wrong with punk. I bought the first Sex Pistols album, and I found it very amusing. I thought it was pretty funny, and okay, fine. That could have been the Stones in a former era. That, the idea of, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, we got three chords. Maybe we don't need three. Perhaps we can pare it down to two. Maybe we don't need a guitarist who can play. What we need is attitude. And so the tail was wagging the dog there for a while. But at the end of the day, a classic record is a classic record. If someone wants to assail it with criticism, etc., and say it was all phony Beatlemania, yeah, fair enough. But at the end of the day, I think you have to say there's room for everybody. Nobody's career is going to get finished off just because another guy says, "Hey, that ain't cool." I mean, who amongst us is safe with that? But ballistic missiles aside, you've just got to do what you do with passion and conviction. And personally, I've been on this 15-year tour, and I don't intend to stop anytime soon until the good Lord calls me. So I'm just happy to still be doing it, making a noise for a living. I love doing it.
It's a fantastic career. I mean, when I look at how much you put out since Genesis, I mean, a lot of people look at you as the Genesis guitarist, but 27 solo albums since coming out with Genesis, so it's
Yeah,
phenomenal. And an incredible body of work. I mean, that was one thing that really stunned me was I don't think I've listened to a lot of your music in depth, and it really stunned me to go back and listen to some of these albums and pull songs out, and it was just really impressed by the breadth of your music. And even in song to song, I mean, you have songs that have such complexity and go through so many different tempo changes and so many different mood swings. And it's just so refreshing to hear that style of music and to kind of have it be fresh album to album, because you've had unique sounds, but have them be different enough where each album is its own unique surprise.
well, thank you for saying so. As I say, a surprise is all part of it. I think the progressive music strength is the fact that because all styles are welcome, provided the bridge works between these various styles and atmospheric sections. We used to say that about in Genesis, that you can put any two pieces of music together, provided you can find a strong enough bridge passage, and I go further and say, yeah, if you can find an atmospheric moment that will link those things, then you start heading towards the long form. You can come up with something. I was talking to Jonas Reingold, who's working on a new album at the moment, and he's playing bass in our band and 12 string and various things. He was saying he's just written a 23-minute piece of music, and we've got a similar thing with Circus and the Night Whale, my latest one, where everything was written in order to be able to run practically concurrently. You know, the idea of the musical continuum and the voyage of that, the Odyssey, if you like, the story unfolding, and that's probably why people like it. That's why it's taken off in the European charts. The idea of starting in 1950, the year I was born, and trying to convey what radio sounded like at that time, using segments from that. So steam trains, babies crying, little bits of news broadcasts from the BBC, all of that in a kind of a soundscape in a way. So I think you can afford to have all of these things. Obviously, the Beatles gave us license to do that, where their songs would wander off all the time. I was just thinking of I Am the Walrus, you know, the best of Lennon McCartney. You get, you know, Lennon's I Am the Walrus and McCartney's Eleanor Rigby, and both of them have great orchestration. And then towards the end, it starts to veer off with Walrus, where it's oompa oompa, stick it up your jumper. That's the thing that British kids used to sing in the playground when we were, you know, 5 years old or whatever.
Yeah.
And that sort of connection to all those things, and then All You Need Is Love, which I believe starts off with La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. So what have the Beatles got to do with that? Well, you know, eventually it becomes, and all these things are permissible within inclusive music. That's the idea. So you can wander off into In the Mood. You can come and go with the time frame. That's what the Beatles were so outrageously good at doing. So no need to be formula. Just keep up and keep surprising us. That's how I see it.
So do you see, you've done a number of collaborations with people. Do you see
Yes.
yourself doing any collaborations coming up in the future?
I'm sure there will be. I've worked with tons of people, and sometimes I don't even remember the things that I've done, and I'll be looking at someone will come up to me and say, "Oh, thank you for playing on my album," and I have to go, "Who's this guy?" You know, I don't remember this, and because I've worked with people all over the world, and usually at home doing a solo for them. I find it can be transformative. You can end up working with people in different areas that have got nothing to do with progressive. Sometimes people phone me up and say, "Can you do some harmonica for me?" And I'm only too happy to do that. Yeah, certainly. Harmonica, koto. Can you do me this? Can you play me some charango? Can you do all that stuff? I mean, when I was at school, I used to win money off kids by saying, "Yes, I can play God Save the Queen" through my nose with a harmonica, and they would bet money that I couldn't do it. And of course, I used to fleece them, shake them down, you know, with this. Terrible kid that I was.
Sounds like you put your mom through the ringer. You have
Yeah.
early part of your book talks about you wandering off a lot.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I did used to wander off. I was terrible. Yeah. They should have tethered me to something. Yeah. I was a great wanderer then, and I am now. My wife Jo and I, we travel the world. We're currently in America, of course, but we've just been to Norway and in the Arctic part of Norway, and a few weeks before that we were in Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, and those extremes probably what's given me my current cough at the moment. But you know, it's those extremes that influence the music. You know, in those frozen wastes in Norway, where there were two hurricanes going on, I was meeting people who could heal you with their hands. I was meeting people who were shooting their own food. I mean, all sorts of stuff. And then being in Victoria Falls, extraordinary, which the locals call the smoke that thunders, that crops up in Tarzan movies and what have you. The power of that is just, it's too great to ignore. So it all becomes music in the end.
It's wonderful how you've captured some of that in your songs. So I'm going to be playing some of your music after we get done with the interview here. And you talk about some of that music being inspired by the places that you traveled.
Yes, I mean, we had 50 miles from the North Pole, which was
Yes.
About travels in Iceland. And that was interesting. There's some Hungarians on it, as well as various things, children's choir.
Yeah, I love that piece. That's one of the ones I'm going to play. So
yeah, well,
nice.
there you go. See, so that's another kind of travelogue, and it just wanders off in the middle, and perhaps never comes back to the original idea of the verse chorus. But surprising music and inclusive music is what it's all about for me.
Well, I'm going to see if I can get you to travel back to the States here. Are you familiar with the Chicago Blues Fest?
Yeah, I've heard of it, and I'm a big blues fan. So
it's the world's largest free blues festival. Happens every year in June. So this year, especially June 9th. So are you familiar with Buddy Guy?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, Buddy Guy is a great. Yeah, I never met him, but he's a great player. Wonderful. He's still going. Great.
So Buddy is turning 90 this year, and so this is going to be his last tour more than likely, and he's going to end his tour. He's going to end his tour in Chicago at the Chicago Blues Fest. So
really,
he's going to be headlining the Chicago Blues Fest on Sunday, June 9th.
Right.
So I would suggest strongly, if you can find a way to make it back to Chicago for any or all of that festival.
Well, I would love to. Unfortunately, I'll be touring the rest of the globe when that happens. But
well, I saw you get a break in your tour. You don't pick up your tour again until July, so you got a break right before July.
No excuses. Get out that suitcase. That's right. Yes.
He turns 90. He's not going to be around that much longer. He's a world treasure.
Yeah, no, I think he is, and I think he's a great performer. And I loved seeing him with the Stones, where everyone else was doing whatever they were doing, and he's doing the one note solo, putting so much into it. And what a character! Great, and he's a great player. He's a guy who's really, 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 really great. Yes.
Have you seen any live performances lately?
I haven't had a chance to catch up with any live performances because I've been doing so many shows at this time. But I saw a little of Joe Bonamassa, talking of blues, playing at the Hollywood Bowl with orchestra.
Yes.
And I met him a few times, and I think that's great. If there's such a thing as progressive blues, I think he's doing it, and I love his work with Beth Hart as well. He's a great player, and to reinvigorate the blues is, I think, what it's all about. What Zeppelin had done at one time, perhaps, and so many of the Brits at one time. Of course, it all comes from here. It's from here. It's from people like Buddy Guy. I've mixed up Muddy Waters and Buddy Guy. But there's an interesting combo for you. I loved all of that, and Little Walter, Sonny Boy Williamson, the great harmonica players, of course, and Larry Adler. Of course, I spent some time with Larry Adler, swapping harmonica techniques, because he was a childhood a hero of mine, and I got to spend some time with him in the UK on a couple of occasions. Very, very interesting. All of that wonderful album that he made with George Martin, with Pete Gabriel opening, singing "Summertime," the album that he did with based on Gershwin material. Great performance by Pete, the wonderful George Martin, and the incomparable Larry Adler.
Wow. Have you ever thought about getting into any other styles of music? I'm thinking of bluegrass in particular. I was just at a
Bluegrass.
I was just at a bluegrass show last night. Do you ever
Well,
get into that music?
you know, I think my banjo chops are sadly lacking. I would probably play it like a flamenco player, but I do fingerstyle, so maybe it's not such a hop. I mean, it's great and wonderful, and American country music is the nice thing. Someone was saying in our band yesterday when we pulled up at a Cracker Barrel, someone was saying the nice thing is that it's all played and sung. It's all real. It's not sampled music. It's music of the people, played by the people. So nothing wrong with that, whether it's the Flatt and Scruggs version or whether it's the later version. It's beautiful stuff. Yep.
Well, and obviously always better live. So seeing you guys live versus an
Yeah.
album, it's just such an amazing thing. It's you guys do such a wonderful job live, especially with that Foxtrot album. It's so incredible to see you guys pull that off, because you're doing songs right now that you couldn't do at Genesis, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, to do the whole of Foxtrot wasn't something that was on offer in the early days. I think that audiences perhaps wouldn't have tolerated it, but now they tend to be more respectful of the quiet moments because they know that something loud is coming up. You know, whereas in the early days, people would shout out, "Oh, you know, boogie, want a boogie, want it right now." They wanted it on more of a monotone, but and you know, you were mentioning about, you know, the country players and all that. And Bella Fleck, of course, you know, a man who is capable of playing you country music and also Debussy on a banjo. It's beautiful, extraordinary stuff.
Well, looking forward to the show. I can't wait. I saw the one in November, and I'm going to go see this one again. So we've got some Wizard listeners coming to the show, and hopefully we can get quite a few more with this interview and with this show. So really
Thank you.
Forward to it. So
I'm very proud of it. It is a great show because I have so many great players and vocal capabilities within the same band. So yeah, I would say you won't be disappointed if you come to see this show.
well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate your time and your insight. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much,
much.
Mark.